5 seconds to submergence. Submergence deep into the absurd.
Okay, we got an in-person podcast today with the one and only Dylan James. I'm sure there's actually plenty of people named Dylan James, but you're one of a kind here in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Oh no, they know where we live now. All right. Anyhow, it's good to have you here. What's happening? What was that Tillich book you were reading?
Oh, Tillich, yeah. So
Tillich?
Tillich. So it's the book.
That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. Well, that's how I've been told it's pronounced in the German.
Well, I was trying to say Tillich's book, but it's Tillich's book.
Tillich, yeah.
Tillich's book.
Yeah,
Okay.
Tillich's book. Tillich is a German existential theologian. He wrote a book called The Courage to Be. To be honest, I haven't finished it yet, so I couldn't really give you a good synopsis. But so far, it seems to be a sort of ontological investigation to the phenomenon of courage, and explaining how it's necessary for affirming your essential being and for having faith.
Yeah, I think because you sent me a text message, and you were saying how this passage that you were reading was kind of reminding you of how Camus was saying that whether or not you embrace life or you don't, you're still going to die.
Yeah, that was part of it. The main gist, I think, was I think Tillich invokes the concept of someone who has the courage or affirmation of life, has the courage and affirmation of death as well as life.
Okay.
Meanwhile, someone who lacks the courage or the power to affirm life can't affirm death. And so even if they wanted to die, they just kind of waste away in cowardice because they're not capable of that sort of affirmation. And he sort of, I think he invoked Freud to talk about that concept. He talked about how the complete affirmation of one's libido, for instance, like the pleasure principle, results ultimately in that sort of collapse of one's power to affirm life and therefore death. So even if you're, wasted out of your mind and you want to die, you're too cowardly to do that because you haven't cultivated the courage to do so.
So if you're controlled by your pleasures, if you're controlled by the reptilian brain, for instance.
The brainstem, yeah.
Sorry, I was like, what does that sound? My dog's eating the food.
Yes.
If you're controlled by your desires, you're unable to will your life.
In the Nietzschean sense. So before that, before he says that, he actually does sort of a very brief history of the ontology of courage. And he ends it on Nietzsche's, right? And he says one of the most profound insights of Nietzsche's philosophy, and something that you mentioned multiple times in the podcast, is that Nietzsche's notion of life includes life in the
Sorry,
common
which
sense.
podcast?
This podcast.
Okay.
So I'm
Just in general.
Yeah,
I see.
in general, yes.
see.
It's sort
I
of
got
it's sort of as a running theme because I just listened to
Yeah.
your first podcast and you seem to mention Nietzsche in this respect, and then
I repeat a lot of things.
well, I mean it's cyclical, it's a return,
Yeah,
eternal
exactly.
return of the same. But yeah, so I mean Nietzsche's conception of life is the affirmation of both life in the common sense or the vulgar sense, and death, right? Which is paradoxical, but from Nietzsche's perspective, they're think from a Heraclitean perspective that they're both opposite ends that hold the string of life together, right? And like an instrument, so you could play on it.
Okay.
And so Tillich, sort of takes acknowledgement of that and sort of says yes to that and says, well, Nietzsche's insight is that to live, to have the affirmation of life, you also have to have the affirmation of your own death, Think of like the father who, affirms life of his children, right? And then lays his life down for them because he is now a part of that Nietzschean cycle of becoming, right? Where death is part of life. But say you have like a really shitty father, right? Who is a coward, right? A pleasure seeker. He only had you by accident. And now people are going to come take you away and maybe kill you. And instead of laying down his life, he gives you up, because he's too afraid, right? So, and he hates himself for it too. So even, so he's guilty, but, or feels guilty for doing that, let's hope. But he's not capable of that courage because he's not yet affirmed life itself in its totality, right? So he hides in pleasures or...
So, because it's kind of, if you don't accept death, then likewise, you aren't accepting life, since death is a natural part of life.
Yeah. So it's sort of the paradox of Heraclitean, superficial paradox that to affirm death is to affirm life and vice versa.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so here's where I do have to ask is that, and obviously when we're talking about these things, people are trying to conquer the fear of death, and they're not necessarily, and a lot of that is trying to conquer the fear of death not through distraction. And pleasure is a distraction, which is why pleasure is bad.
Sure. Well,
Right.
it could be a distraction.
Because,
yeah.
well, where I was going with that is that pleasure is also a natural part of life, right? Just as death is. And I don't necessarily think that they're 100% saying, hey, don't do anything pleasurable, right? They're just saying that if you're consumed by your pleasures,
If you become a slave to it.
if you become a slave to your pleasures, then you're not actually affirming your life because you're just walking along a track, like on a treadmill.
Yeah.
Because
well,
you're
being
just not
led by a leash, essentially.
exactly
Yeah.
led by a leash, just like a dog.
Yeah. As Nietzsche would say, the short leash of one's pains and pleasures.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we discussed this over text before this podcast.
Yep.
You know, the pleasure principle, pleasure in general, can become that sort of sense of escapism. You know, that some people seek. You know, and we talked about escapism a little bit. And I remember I mentioned escapism as a form of the contempt for being, which is such a dramatic phrase, but I think it does encapsulate it a little bit. I mean, I sort of struggle on that.
I think you're right.
Right, but I mean, I do have reservations or ways of hedging it. So, like, one way to hedge it is that I think I subscribe to the Schopenhauerian aesthetic, you know, theory, which is basically beauty or aesthetics is the objective contemplation of the world absent of a self. But again, in Schopenhauer's sense, it doesn't mean literally absence of one's individuality, full stop. It means the absence of one's willing in order to contemplate the world as a whole. So, like, I had this experience once where I went to, I had never seen Apocalypse Now, went to IMAX and saw the director's cut.
Yep.
And I sat there for about, I can't remember how long it is, so somewhere between 2 and 3 hours, completely
You know who the
forgetting.
director is? Sorry.
Oh, gosh, I forgot.
Is it Zack Snyder? It's not.
No, it's not Zack Snyder.
Right.
I don't think it is. Yeah.
Go forward,
Yeah,
sorry.
no, posterity's going to listen to this podcast and call us plebs because we can't name the director, but whatever. Yeah, no, I mean, I sat there and I watched the whole thing from beginning to end and completely forgot I was there. You know, except for the brief, you know, like comment from someone beside me or to kind of move myself around. And it was a beautiful experience because I felt like I was observing this.
Trapped in the illusion.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it wasn't an illusion in the sense of there were certainly things in the film that I wanted to look away from. So, like the life slaughtering of the cow, right? Certain themes, you know, when they gunned down the ship on the river that had no harm.
I haven't seen the movie.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, so maybe we can record another podcast once you've seen it because it's really a religious experience. Well, I mean, more so because if you think about it, its history, the creator almost committed suicide while trying to create a final cut of the film because it was so depressing. And he had so much footage to work with. The hearsay is that he was on the verge of suicide. He had suicidal ideation. And so when you look at the film through that lens, you know, it makes a lot more sense. You know, it's basically an absurdist film in a lot of ways.
And what's it about?
To be honest, I've only seen it twice, so I'm trying to remember exactly the plot.
Are they
but they're in Vietnam, so it's a
Okay,
Vietnam
that's what I
War
thought.
film. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a Vietnam. That's what I was asking for. I wasn't sure if it was like a sci-fi film or.
Yeah, no, it's a wartime film. It's based off of Conrad's short story, The Heart of Darkness, which I just purchased and wanted.
I've heard of The Heart of Darkness.
Yeah. So it's based off that, and the gist of it is that they had some higher up in the military who went rogue. He was extremely efficient, but the way he became efficient is because he went beyond good and evil. So essentially, he started doing guerrilla tactics that were, from the layman's perspective, immoral. But it was effective, and he was winning the war. And then eventually got to the point where he kind of had a narcissistic break, and then crossed the border into Cambodia and became worshipped as a god by his own men. And so someone's sent over there to try to assassinate him, essentially.
Wow.
But it's a descent into madness. So you start with this sort of superficial madness where, a general napalms a village, and they're laughing, and the Ride of the Valkyries playing in the background. But then as they get closer and closer to the center of madness, like there's a scene on the threshold where they're fighting in the middle of the night, and they have no idea what the hell's going on. Everyone's throwing grenade launchers and so on, and the guy's on the mission asks, like, who are we fighting against? Like, where are they? And no one has no idea. Like, no one even knows why they're there anymore. They're just, blazed out of their minds trying to survive, and then they continue on. And it's very Nietzschean in the sense of, or I shouldn't say even Nietzschean, it's actually more Dostoevskian, because once we get to the heart of darkness, so to speak, to this man who's abandoned conventional morality, he in some senses is in permanent disquietude. He says the horror, reflecting on his own actions, right? Kind of like Russian, but I think it's Raskolnikov, who murders that woman with the axe, and then thinks he can overcome morality rationally, but then becomes beholden to the witnesses within his soul that are accusing him of murder, so to speak.
But I mean, more or less, like, let's say just the victims of this man, they're wondering, when's the apocalypse going to happen? And he's saying, apocalypse
is now. Yeah, exactly.
Right, because when I think apocalypse, a lot of people are thinking it's like the whole planet, the world's ending. Right. But right now, there's an apocalypse in Ukraine. Right now, there is an apocalypse in Gaza. Wherever there is war, there is apocalypse. Wherever there is famine, there is apocalypse. Because apocalypse is a thing that happens to a community, a society, etc., etc. It's just like, it's the world ending for a group.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
I think one helpful way to think about this is Heidegger's notion of worldhood. Because, and in English, we kind of keep this notion too, right? So we say world in one sense as the universe that is subject to scientific investigation. So everything from the Big Bang up to the present and to the foreseeable future, with material objects in a capsule, so to speak, that we call the universe. So that's one sense of world, right? But then there's another sense of world in which we say something like the world of a podcaster, or the world of a librarian, and so on.
Yeah.
And Heidegger was more interested in that sense of world because phenomenologically it was the most immediate. In fact, he claimed, I think rather controversially for still a lot of people, that the scientific world in sort of a way comes after the fact. It's there all along, of course, but we only come in contact with it through our worlds of like being a scientist, right, or being a podcaster. Like even as we're talking to access certain truths that we find in each other through our dialectic, needs to be the world the podcast opens up those possibilities. Now, I'm reading a book on Heidegger, or Rethinking Death in and After Heidegger by Ian Thompson, and the book discusses the distinction between demise and existential death. So demise is basically the notion of like, you got cancer and now you're going to die in a week. And in a week's time, you demise. But in contrast to existential death, which is the death of your world, essentially, and so when we think of it like that, right, when people like apocalypse preppers, right, prepare for the end, whether or not they realize that what they're actually preparing for is the end of the world in the Heideggerian sense, not the objective sense. Because the fucking world's going to die and the universe would be just fine without us. Yep. The universe isn't going anywhere.
Exactly.
It's their world.
Yep.
The world of, say, the American or
humanity.
Or humanity, yep, gone. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so like when we think of apocalypse now, actually there's some contemporary theologians actually talk about apocalypse in this sense. Like what they meant, like some people actually believe the reason that the apocalypse hasn't happened in the sense that people usually think of it, especially in biblical literalist circles. Revelations, it hasn't happened yet, or at least in some people's views has already happened, is because what they meant by the end of the world was something more Heideggerian, I would say, like in the sense of like the world of Rome, or the world of Christianity, right? And so I don't know. Like, so we think of apocalypse now that
we killed him.
Yeah, we killed him. Yeah, but think of God like as the guiding ideal of a world, right? It has finally collapsed, It's really horrifying to experience. I'll tell you, no amount of mental preparation can prepare you for the feeling of despair you get when your world actually ends. I mean, Stoics, claim that you could do that, but I think that's bull crap. At least from my anecdotal experience, you can try to prepare for the end of your world, but once you experience the death of your wife, for instance, or a family member, nothing can prepare you for that.
Or even a breakup.
Yep.
Or your job's ending. Any dramatic change, you're more or less entering a new reality. Because whenever something like that happens, it feels like I don't know if you've ever been in I know you're in a long-term, you're married right now.
Yes.
But I don't know if you've ever been in a long-term relationship that ended. And when that does happen, when you've been spending your life with someone and you get accustomed to it, when that split happens, it feels like you're entering an alternate reality because the whole world, your entire world changes, right?
Yes.
Your entire life, your entire routine, everything changes after that gets cut off.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the idea of existential death is pretty much that. So it's the idea that once your world collapses, it's not that you don't have worldhood per se. You still have bills to pay. You still have people that love you or hate you. You're still sitting on a couch or at work. But the difference is now you're in a state of being where the raw becoming of the world is coming at you. Well, and it could be life-threatening or not, or just trivial, but you just can't give a rat's ass about it. There's something about that collapse of worldhood where it's I have no God, let's say, or ideals to help me choose between right and wrong or left from right, and now I'm just floating. That's kind of the feeling of existential death. And unfortunately, as Nietzsche predicted, some people would feel that on a mass scale with the decline in religious views guiding morality, and then the introduction of secularism. So and so I think, so kind of drawing on our earlier conversation about Camus, Camus in his own way, I think very rightly in his absurdist philosophy, was trying to point out that the inference from that there is no God in this sense, and then therefore life is not worth living, is a false inference. It's a fallacy. Obviously, things don't stop mattering to me just because there isn't a God. I still am hungry. I still love my wife. I still love to watch the stars and go on hikes. Just because there isn't that sort of transcendent destiny doesn't mean anything else is devalued.
So I have an interesting take on. Well, I don't want to be cocky, but so I think belief and identity go hand in hand, right? You can't believe something that goes against your identity. Otherwise, you'll have a crisis, right? So one day I was telling a friend, I said, we were talking about something, and then I mentioned to him, it's kind of like that. It's kind of like the no God, no meaning fallacy, right? If there's no God, and therefore there's no meaning.
Yeah, well, the death of God's still meaningful, which means that you can mean without God.
Yeah, so and then he said, no, that meaning is impossible without God.
Really? Well, that's a very strong claim.
Yeah, so then his belief is that meaning is impossible without God. That without God, there is no meaning, right?
And just to be clear, by God, he means a transcendent entity, in the sense of the Christian God, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And then I thought, well, I starkly disagree with anyone who says that with such conviction. Maybe if you say maybe there's no meaning without God, right? But I came to the conclusion, well, if he didn't believe that, how could he be Christian? Right? Because if you said, oh, there can be meaning without God, then in that sense, you're not Christian anymore, right? Because that goes against your beliefs, your fundamental beliefs, which is a fundamental part of your identity, right? In the same way, me being agnostic, I can't ever say with conviction that there can be meaning with God or there can't be meaning with God or without God, right? Because that would fundamentally go against my identity if I said that with conviction, I believed something, right? For sure, for certain. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, this reminds me of our conversation at the fireplace. We touched on it very briefly, but we talked about worldhood again.
Okay.
And the fourfold structure of worldhood. So you think of a world, right? So let's say the world of podcaster. While you're in a world, you're always in the midst of an activity of sorts, you know?
Yeah.
Right now we're in the midst of a podcast, right?
Yeah.
That's the activity.
Is this recording?
Yeah, it's recording. Thankfully. So actually, that's funny enough. That's the second point of worldhood. So worldhood is also that you're not only just in an activity, but in an activity amidst things, primarily equipment. So like right now we have the phone as a piece of equipment. We have the camera as a piece of equipment, right? Table, the cup, everything. My clothes keep me warm in here. Yeah. So all this paraphernalia that we don't even think about in this sort of harmony that allows us to
And then there's the people
activity.
who are watching the podcast too.
That's right. No, yeah. We're you're our instrument. No, just joking. No. I mean, for real, yeah, that's part of it. And so that's the first two steps. The third step, though, is called the in order to, right? So we're in the midst of an activity, surrounded by equipment, in order to do what? Well, in this case, complete the podcast. Now, this last part, though, is most important because this relates to your point about identity. So Heidegger says, well, what's the point of this activity and the order to and so on? And he says, well, the sort of center of it is that for the sake of which you're doing it, right? The teleology, so to speak, in the genuine Aristotelian sense. I remember someone saying to me, or not to me, sorry, they didn't say directly, it was something I read about Heidegger. They commented that Heidegger was one of the last Aristotelians, and I totally believe that. Because he's trying to characterize worldhood around teleology, right? So that for the sake of which a world exists. That is the thing that hinges the world. And so in this case, what hinges the world is you're doing this for the sake of being a podcaster, right? And that is your identity. You interpret your existence such that you have cultivated possibilities up to this very moment where we're doing this podcast, right? And that's what makes it possible to do this world. Now, what happens when you have identity crisis? Well, he says, well, then the world either dissipates entirely or you just don't give a damn about it anymore. You know, like you might wake up tomorrow and say, you know what? I think doing podcasts is bullshit. I won't do it anymore because I don't identify that as being that.
Yeah. Well, there's also a sense of mediocrity.
Sure.
If you feel yourself mediocre or imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Another big one.
Yeah.
If you feel like you're not doing a good job at something or you're not good at it or proficient or at a point where you imagine yourself to be, then you're not going to feel like you are that thing because you have a perfect idea of what a podcaster is, a perfect idea of what a professor is.
Yeah.
And because you have that perfect idea of what it is, when you go and you do that thing and you don't fulfill your own perfect expectations, you don't feel like you are that thing.
Right. And what's interesting, again, is that to have an identity doesn't necessarily mean to fulfill your identity. That, again, because identity in this sense that we're using it here for worldhood is simply a guiding ideal for your actions. So like you have this implicit ideal of, say, being a podcaster, right? That you can hold yourself to that standard and feel guilty when you fall short of it. But that's only because you interpret yourself as that identity. Because if I'm not a podcaster, I don't give a damn about that identity, you know? I mean, you see this all the time in vulgar interpretations of life. You know, like you might be in the midst of doing something that you care about, and some whack job comes up to you and judges you based off of some sort of idea that they think you're supposed to be. They identify you as somebody and say you should be that. And you have sort of this kind of dissonance where you're just like, where the hell did you come from? Like I don't think I'm that person at all. So I don't see why my life is negative in that way. But sometimes that can change, right? So maybe someone isn't living up to something that they decided that they want to be, and someone's acknowledging that and showing that to them. And I think that it requires lots of wisdom or discernment to tell the difference between when people are asking us to own up to the ideals that or the identities that we have chosen versus asking us to
The ones that they've chosen.
Exactly. And instead of pressuring us, right, to be part of the herd and to just do what everyone else does. So it requires a sense of self-knowledge and wisdom to tell the difference between the two, and humble yourself in the former and tell them off in the latter.
Because sometimes you really do need someone to say, hey, Greg, you're doing this too much.
Yeah.
You need to stop.
Absolutely.
Just like, God damn it, you're right.
Yeah, but again, that can only happen because you've interpreted your existence a particular way. Now, here's where worldhood and the collapse of worldhood kind of come to touch here. So the only point at which your identity collapses, right, is when either you cannot no longer care for that for the sake of which your world exists, or the conditions that make it possible go away. So here's a good example. Imagine like you're a hockey player, right? Now you could objectively have all the conditions to be a hockey player. Like you're the best on your team. You know, your coach loves you. You've been offered a full-ride scholarship if you just, join one particular team. But maybe you just wake up one day and you go, I really don't care about hockey pucks anymore.
Yeah, like, I hate
this.
If I have to see this ice rink one more
fucking time, I think I'll commit homicide or something. Yeah, no, for real. That's something that some people experience, and it's very subjective. Another way that could happen though is maybe you're subjectively into it. Maybe you're just having like a great time in your life, and then you realize you have cancer. And now that was possible as a cutoff, and that's sort of in a sense where one's demise and one's existential death can correlate, because it's like, well, what better existential death than your demise? Like, now suddenly all these possibilities you've cultivated for your world are cut off permanently.
So there's a great movie that talks about this. It's called Puss in Boots 2.
Wait, are you thinking Puss in Boots 2 or Puss in Boots the Last Wish?
The Last Wish.
The Last Wish, yeah.
Have you seen it?
I have. I was actually amazed at how existential it was. It also has, unironically, one of my favorite villains now.
The big Jack Horner.
Jack Horner, yeah. He brings back the old-fashioned
He's just evil for the sake of
I got the oh my god. You got the Jiminy Cricket from It's a Wonderful Life, trying to convince him that, is a better way of doing things.
So what do you think about all these movies that want to sympathize with the villain? Do you think it's gone overboard? Like, hey, we just want a movie where the villain sucks. They're just evil.
Well, I mean,
come on.
That's a really complicated question.
Like Thanos. You can relate to Thanos.
Okay. So I can't really give a really good answer because I haven't thought about this too much. But my kind of hot take is that I think the point of having sympathetic villains should be to reveal to us a virtue that we're missing in the evil. So think of like Nietzsche's sort of genealogy of morals, right? We think of the devil or the evil as, being, powerful and, and unsubservient, right? But then he says, well, maybe we missed something here. Maybe we've demonized virtues due to sort of historical genealogy that we've forgotten about. And maybe if I return your gaze to it, maybe we can learn something about how to have a better life. Like, there's something to be said for that. But I think sympathizing with the villain for the sake of sympathizing with the villain, though, doesn't make a lot of sense. Because if their behavior is destructive and, like we said, motivated by contempt for being, at the very least, it's instructive for who not to be. But to almost try to sympathize to the point where I would want to do what they're doing doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, maybe, again, to be sympathetic or charitable, you could interpret it as revealing a part of ourselves collectively that we feel, but don't necessarily want to acknowledge, right? So Jack Horner is kind of a funny example because he's just pure id. Just id with absolutely no sense of morality. Just does the most efficient thing, even if it kills people, right? And why does he want the wish? There's no sympathetic reason. It's just because he wants it. He just wants all the power.
All the magic.
Yeah, he's just all the magic in the world. He's basically like Sauron. Like, he's just like, I don't care about, helping people. Just power for the sake of power. Yeah. And I think it's hilarious because in a way we all have that sort of childish id that is like that. We can sympathize, I suppose, in that way. I mean, if we mean by sympathize, we mean that we understand. Like, I understand Jack Horner, but I have but unlike Jack Horner, we have the emotional maturity of at least someone beyond their 13 years.
Yeah.
So we're not like so narcissistic that we just can't comprehend the fact that other human beings exist in our world and how complicated desires are more important than ours in some ways.
Exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of my hot
No,
take.
it does. I think I mean, I like all movies. I like movies with a really bad villain, like Voldemort or Sauron.
Sure. Yeah.
And I like movies with a villain that you can relate to, like Thanos, right? Because in the real world, there are psychopaths, sociopaths that are just totally evil. Period. They just go and they just want to kill, or they just want to be evil for the sake of being evil.
Sure.
Right? Or for the sake of power, sake of some desire of theirs, right? It has nothing to do with a good intention. There's no good intention.
Right.
But there are some forces in the world that do have a good intention, and they have their side of the story where they think, for instance, we can look at Osama bin Laden, right? Osama bin Laden, one might say, is pure evil, terrible person, right? He killed people, right? However, from his point of view, he thinks that the United States government was terrorizing his citizens and the people in the Middle East, right? So then when he did those attacks, when he did those things, he felt himself to be justified in what he was doing, right? That is someone that we can relate to. Hey, what happens if you're in your country in the U.S. and people started sending bombs and killing people in your country, right? You'd be a little bit upset, right? But that's different than the guy who went and stabbed those 4 people in Moscow, 2 years ago now? 1 year ago now? Where he just did it for the sake of doing it. He just went and he killed people for absolutely no reason. There was no moral venture there. He wasn't trying to get revenge. He wasn't trying to.
Sure.
It was just pure evil, right?
Right.
There's different. So, like in movies, it's like, hey, sometimes there's going to be a pure evil villain, and sometimes there's going to be someone that has something they want to do. What they do is still evil or bad, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't feel themselves to be justified in their own regard, or that that other people can see their justification, right?
That's really that actually brings me to a point that I wanted to make a minute or two ago. So there's this notion that I think that people often think of evil as something univocal, and I think part of the postmodern plea.
Sorry, define univocal really fast.
Sorry, so univocal just means it's said in one sense. So, for example, if I said Dylan, right, that term by itself is not necessarily, univocal, because it could denote many different entities, besides me. So when we're using it, I mean it just in my sense. I mean, it's kind of a technical term of art, but that's kind of the idea.
It's subjective.
No, I mean,
evil is subjective.
Well, it's context dependent, I suppose, in some sense. But where I was going with this is there's a distinction between, I think, sorrow and evil, like you're saying, from different perspectives, and maybe contempt for being. So here's something that came to my mind. So imagine like you have a family, right, and they're dying of thirst in a desert, right, and you're going to the only oasis within like 100 miles, right, just for sake of argument. And if you don't go to this oasis, you're going to die. Your child's going to die. Everyone's going to die. You get there, and you see another family, and they're equally thirsty, and they need to drink from the oasis, and there's not enough, for both of you. So what do? It's like, well, then you have to kill each other for it, basically. Like fight to the last man, scrape for it if you're going to live. I mean, otherwise you could just give up and die. But at that point, if you decide to live, like, damn it, we're going to do this. I'm gonna kill you, man. Like, I'm sorry. like my family needs to live. Now that's just tragic, So I think tragedy isn't evil. It's just, it's mean and it's brutal, and we should live in a world where that shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
So I think we should cultivate possibilities where when we are thirsty, we don't have to kill each other for it, right? Which is something that capitalism does. But what's interesting is then. Contrast that with a situation where imagine like a child in a tribe who's being bullied, right, and mocked. Maybe he has a deformity. Maybe he's, autistic or something.
Yeah, he's not good at throwing the spear.
He's not good at throwing the spear. Maybe he's
stuck at throwing the spear.
Yeah, maybe he's a non-contributor just because he's born a certain way, right? Like maybe he's just botched at birth and it's not his fault. Right? So already God condemned him. God said you're worthless. And God reminds him every day, you're worthless. Your being's worthless. You deserve to die. And this happens on a daily basis, and it tortures him for years. And finally he just wakes up one day and says, I'm going to burn the village down. I'm going to kill everyone. And I'm going to stand there and laugh. Now, this is a very different, qualitatively different situation, I'd say. Because in the former case, it's this tragedy, right? It's this tragic state of affairs where you both want to live and you're having to kill each other for it. But I think it's qualitatively different, though, to have a human being who is so disgusted and so fed up with life that they would, say, shoot up a school, right?
Yeah.
Or in the case of Hitler is a good example. Like during World War II, he was beginning to lose because he was allocating resources to the Holocaust. And he could have easily won the war, I think, if he had pulled resources away from killing Jews and spent it on the front lines where it would have made a difference. But he didn't. He just kept killing them. I mean, what kind of mindset do you have to say, you know what, I'm going to destroy this nation just so that I can make as many people suffer and die as possible? It makes no strategic sense. So in that sense, I mean, maybe the Oasis is a good microcosmic example of war in a legitimate sense. Like you're fighting over, unlike modern day, warfare, like you think of like the Bush administration and the oil, grab. But you think of it in terms of like, well, we have to fight for resources. We have to engage in some sort of conflict, but it's not necessarily out of resentment and contempt. It's like, it's tragic. You almost cry doing it because you have to, and you want to at least have a future for your children where they never have to see war. They never have to deal with that. But then again, that's different than the point of view where the sole purpose of engaging in conflict is to destroy for the sake of it because you hate everything. I think that's very different. And I would say the latter comes closer to genuine evil, I would say. And I think people shy away from the tragic view of, war and aggression because it's scary, and people don't want to deal with it. And some of us don't have the power to deal with it either. So I think there's some virtue, so kind of like what we're talking about, villain sympathy, where we can, or empathy, depending on who you are. To say like, well, yeah, some of them are corrupted by suffering, and maybe turn to a path of contempt for being, but there was a point at which they were just trying to do the right thing, and I think maybe that's a good bridge between the two. So you can think of like the father finally kills the other family so his family can live and they get out of the desert. But that experience is scarred him for life. He never thought he could kill a child, but he did. It's for his own child's being. And then the child grows up and has no memory of the event because they're too young to remember. And the father keeps his secret from him. He's trying to return to society to deal with people. And now that he's realized the limits of his own being, maybe that experience had corrupted him to the point now where he can't discern the difference anymore between right and wrong. And maybe he becomes more sociopathic. Maybe he decides, you know what, the world is just like that. The world is just a battleground where everyone has to fight for themselves. And so he extends beyond the necessary to, say, expand himself and hurt people and anticipate, unnecessarily irrationally anticipating them best down in the back. And so he has to act first. And suddenly grows into this sort of contempt for humanity and their greed. And eventually they become a Sauron. Like they become some sort of sociopathic billionaire now who's just after money for the sake of money because they're suffering, right? With the world, the tragedy has finally got to them. Yeah. So that's probably a bridge there.
I mean, I do wonder, though, is that the guy in the tribe that was bullied, he was also in a tragedy, right? And it's a tragedy that there was an environment that created that. But at the same time, you can't just expect us all to go around handing out our sympathies to murderers.
Right.
Right? That's just, that's not how it works. That's not how it should work. Because otherwise people are going to go around and murder more, right?
Well, I mean, if you tolerated cancer, it will just grow, and kill the body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not, it's not necessarily that I don't care for these people and that I'd want to fix them and change them. But in the real world, a lot of times you can't change someone. No matter what you give them, no matter what you try, no matter how nice you are, that person is just going to be that person, right? And it's kind of the sad thing about life is that, there's just some people you can't change.
Yeah, I think that's very stoic. You can only control your own actions. You can't control the actions of others. But maybe a good sociological perspective of this is to say that, people like school shooters just don't get created in a vacuum. There certainly conditions.
Yeah, well, that's why I said that it's a tragedy. but after the tragedy happens,
Oh,
we
I see.
can't go and fix it afterwards.
Oh, I
we
see,
can
I
prevent
see.
it. We can try to prevent it.
So kind of like the boulders started rolling down the hill, but now it's gained so much momentum that if you get in front of it, you just
Exactly.
get crushed. I
Exactly.
see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, totally. No, I see what you're saying. I think, again, from a sociological perspective, and more than that, I mean, even a materialist perspective, if you want, look at the conditions that lead to those sorts of things and see what we can do to try to prevent it. Because again, it's in the community's self-interest. Like you don't want your child to, be afraid to go to school because they're not sure if they're going to get out alive. Just because of this, phenomenon that no one's drawing attention to because they're too afraid to look at it. And maybe part of the reason they're too afraid to look at it is because maybe they're not taking responsibility for how they caused it. Say they like the village, right? Finally dies because of this person has had enough, right? And some of them might be, gullible enough to believe that, oh, he chose this. Oh, he could have chosen otherwise, but he's just a bad person. But they refuse to acknowledge the fact that they kicked and beat him. In his lowest moment instead of giving him a hand.
Well, I would even argue that that they would have seen him acting up a little bit,
Perhaps, yeah.
and they would have grabbed the rock and see you, bud.
Yeah, see you, bud. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one way
He looks like he's about to burn down the village.
Sure. But sometimes people don't look that way, and sometimes they do. I mean, it's really complicated.
Yeah.
I can't imagine people like doing the society having this sort of a pretension of absolute knowledge to go, you're going to do this like necessarily, and therefore we're going to step in. That would require the position of being a god to see all the causal faculties involved to know just the second when it's irreversible.
No, it is interesting that some people are these ticking time bombs. Really, like a ticking time bomb, because someone is just going through their life. You see them at school every day, and then one day they just show up with a gun, right? And you don't know when that's going to be. You didn't expect it. Sure, you might have been like, that guy's kind of weird. But one day he shows up with a gun and you didn't expect it. And next thing you know, all your friends are dead. It's interesting that a human mind can become a bomb in a way.
And almost literally, if you think of suicide bombers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, so again, we kind of talked about this over text. I think of that contempt for being. And again, I'm not entirely convinced of this, but I find it very persuasive. I think that, animals have pain and pleasure, and we as animals by extension do. But human beings and other beings with Dasein or with this sort of self-reflexive standing out in existence also suffer. Because, like the child could get beaten, but if he forgets the next 5 minutes, he's all the better. He's just like, why am I bruised? He addresses wounds, and then a few minutes later, and then or like a few days later, then it suddenly forgot he was even beaten. Beats the same person again and goes like, hey, you look nice. And they go, hey, you're nice too, because the person that beat him didn't forgot he did it. As Nietzsche said, paraphrasing here, the ignorant get the best of their blunders, right? But it's only the introduction of memory, right? And this ability to reflect. Oh, he hit me. And now I registered that, and now I'm gonna never forget that,
Well, a lot of times they'll think, because like people who are victims, a lot of times they'll think that they could have prevented it by being a better person, right? So like, let's say that you have an abusive husband, right? And this husband goes and he beats his wife. And the wife, being the abused, she might come to the conclusion that, I guess
I deserved it, or
I guess I shouldn't have done talk to him that way. Like I could have prevented this if I had been nicer, right? You get this attitude where the victim gets blamed, but that blame gets internalized for them, right? So like the husband beats her, he blames her for, you deserve this, right? And then she internalizes that, right? So it's kind of this thing where sometimes we remember that we were hit, but we believe that it was our fault that we got hit, even though another person did it and they had the full freedom to not do it.
Right, and I think maybe that comes back to interpretation. I mean, you can think of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, right? The slave versus master mentality. So the slave, ultimately wants what's best for them, but they think what's in their best interest is for the master, right? They have to ask for permission for the master to do things, right? They have to, if they get hit on the cheek, they turn the other cheek, right? So they get hit again. And I think, part of the way Nietzsche approached the problem of good and evil in his essay was to simply say, well, hey, maybe we missed something in the master attitude. And the way it maybe can be synthesized with the slave attitude and the Übermensch, right? That maybe we deserve some sense of self-respect, and maybe that's in our nature to do so. Yeah. And instead of shying away from that and calling it evil, maybe we should stand up for ourselves every now and again and love ourselves for who we are. And honestly, like, it's no coincidence, I think, that lots of abuse happens in the church, because in the church you're taught that slave mentality. So if father abuses you, then like, as in like father, like priest abuses you, then that's either your fault or is deserved, or you're meek and you're in the pejorative sense, right? Not in the actual sense of the word, and you don't do anything about it, right? I mean, that's just contemptible. And then what's even worse is that often people who are abused become abusers because they internalize that hatred, right? So as Nietzsche kind of pointed out in Genealogy, right, like, you have a slave attitude, but you still want to be a master in your own way. So what happens? Well, you internalize that hatred and that need to lash out, and so you lash out on other children. So maybe you become a priest again yourself, and now you're alone with kids in a parish, so in the middle of nowhere, with no one to hold you accountable. And then you just say, you know what, I'm going to ruin their lives. I'm going to pleasure myself with them, and then I'm going to gaslight them, tell them it's their fault. I mean, it's horrible, right? But like, that's kind of the in a way that's genuine evil, in the sense of they're not just an animal that grabs onto an object and fucks it because they're horny and then forgets that they did it. This is a conscious being who's aware of their existence and suffering, who is intentionally inflicting suffering on others because they felt the same. In a way they hold a hatred for being, and they're like, you needed to feel what I felt.
Yeah, it's almost like you're possessing them with a demon in a way. That's right. Like when you give abuse to someone, you almost possess them with a demon. And I mean, obviously, I mean that 100% symbolically.
Yeah.
In the sense that you have this horror within you, and you want to bring that onto other people to let that out of you in a way, and it kind of infects the other person.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like how suffering begets suffering. But again, suffering as something distinct from pain. Again, making the distinction between pain as an animalic phenomenon and suffering as something indicative of the existential, like of being self-aware of one's suffering, or of one's pain, or one's tragedy, right?
Maybe you want someone to relate to you too.
Yeah, that's part of it.
You bring that suffering upon another person so that there's another person in the world who feels how you feel.
It almost justifies your existence, right? Like now you find someone else just as miserable as you, and you drag them to your level, so now you don't feel like you're alone. Yeah.
Or maybe you can also justify your abuser. Let's say that you loved your abuser. Let's say that they might have abused you, but you still love them, but you couldn't justify what they did. So then you go and you do those same actions, and in a sense, that justifies what they did to you. Right?
Yeah, it's crazy. And again, that comes from the perspective that you suffered this, and you can't reconcile your suffering, so you seek to perpetuate it in a kind of ironic way to justify it. And again, that's sort of the idea that people can suffer anything, but suffering without meaning, is almost impossible. So in a way, they're trying to find meaning to their suffering, right? So kind of going back to the Oasis or example, we'll talk about Schopenhauer a little bit, and I think we should definitely have a discussion at some point about Schopenhauer's influence on Nietzsche, because I think you can't ever discuss Nietzsche without Schopenhauer. But
do you have any top points?
Yes. But you think of like the blind striving for survival, right? Or the primordial striving for existence for the sake of existing, right? That perpetuates these families that kill each other, right? For the sake of water. And being, again, not being an animal, but having sufficient intellect to be self-reflective and ask yourself, why are you doing this? Why do I want to live, right? Hence Nietzsche pointed out in Schopenhauer, the will for nothingness is sort of born out of that suffering. Schopenhauer had this famous saying that the point of that life does have a meaning, or our teleology, and the teleology is to realize that you shouldn't live it. The teleology is to suffer as hard as you can to just finally realize that you shouldn't have existed in the first place. And Nietzsche, I think, embraced that attitude for a while before he started his own path, right, to try to overcome it. And again, one of his ways of overcoming it was by pointing out the fallacy in Schopenhauer's reasoning that if the world is will, then your intellect itself is will, and so hence you can use your intellect to justify your willing, like the suicide bomber or the ascetic does when they embrace their contempt for being and will nothingness, rather than not willing at all, you know? So yeah, no, I mean, discussion of Schopenhauer should happen at some other point, but yeah, I like this discussion distinguishing between, you know, plain tragedy and just the malevolence of human beings that is born from the corruption of suffering that turns into a contemptive being, let's say. Yeah.
Well, I mean, sometimes, you know, you're farming, you're growing crops, and one of the crops that don't look quite right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like maybe you didn't water it right, maybe some of the water didn't get there correctly, maybe you put too many pesticides over there. Either way, it doesn't look right. And all the other ones look fine. Oh man, this field looks great, but this one, it don't look very good.
No, something's wrong.
And there's things that you could have done to prevent it, but sometimes things just spring up.
Yeah, and that's tragedy.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I hate this sort of notion of responsibility where literally everything bad that happens in your life is your fault. And I think that's probably due to theological conditioning. You know, I mean, even in secular society, we're still in this sort of religious stage where we want to seek an explanation for one's suffering. We always point at your actions. You know, like Jordan Peterson is sort of like the penultimate example of this, right? Instead of accepting the fact that sometimes life just hates you, you know, prima facie, because that's just the way it happened. He always says, well, think about how you could be responsible. What could have you done? Da, da, da. Always points back to you. Like, what could have you done? And I think at this point I can sympathize a little bit with Schopenhauer's perspective. You know, Schopenhauer talks a lot about tragedy because he embraced aesthetics as sort of a way of escaping suffering. And he said that his idea of tragedy, and I totally agree with this, is a story where someone does everything right and still fails. That he does everything right. He's nice. He tries the best he can. He works so hard, and in the end, everything just comes for naught.
Yeah.
You know, and that's genuine tragedy. I think, you know, that's what I mean by tragedy if I ever used the word. Yeah. And again, that can corrupt someone and turn them into a will for nothingness, as Schopenhauer would say. You know, I mean, Schopenhauer would say will for nothingness, but he wouldn't call it corruption. He would call it pure like sanctification. You know, and hence Nietzsche's gateway to understand the psychology of asceticism, right, and the ascetic ideal. You know.
So, in your text messages, you were writing, and you just use this as an example, but just for the sake of picking from your mind, what does it mean when someone falls in love?
I was thinking of songs. There's one called something of that nature, like "Why Do I Fall in Love?" And so that's kind of a topic changer, but maybe a good bridge from the line of thought that we just started here. Might be like you think of the family, right, fighting over the oasis, right, and they ask themselves, "Why am I doing this?" Now the scientists can come in, put on their spectacles, and like, well, obviously you're an organism that wants to survive because of these biological functions. And it's like, fuck you. Like, that's not what they're asking, you nerd. They're not asking about not looking for a cause in an objective world. They're asking a metaphysical question. You know, why is there something rather than nothing? In other words, why must I suffer rather than not suffer? In the sense of, you know, why did this tragedy have to happen in the first place? Again, in a non-causal sense. And so anyway, when like in songs, they say things like, why did I fall in love? They're not asking for some scientist come in and say, well, you see, you're a prepubescent child in the 50s, and, you know, you're in a culture that, you know, is now becoming more promiscuous and whatever. It's like, no. They're asking existentially, and I think one song actually encapsulate this. It's called the song, Why Do Fools Fall in Love? But then she goes, why do birds sing in the breeze, or something like that. You know, she goes on to all these other whys that are totally unrelated, because she's kind of pointing out the amazement of its being rather than some sort of causal feature. Yeah. It's just because that's the way nature is, you know. And so kind of connected with Schopenhauer's like idea of will as sort of this meaningless striving that just exists or perpetuates existence for the sake of existence. You know, when we ask why, we kind of hit the keel of the mind there, because it's like, well, why being? There is no why. It just wants to be. It is, and that's in some sense, I think maybe why philosophy exists is to constantly return us to that amazement that there is something rather than nothing, in that sense, and not in the sense of that, oh, I'm ignorant of the causes, right? Because if I ask why is there something rather than nothing, and you gave me a causal explanation, I'd still be dissatisfied, because it doesn't answer the question, in the sense of it doesn't answer or address the encounter I have with being and my amazement of it, right?
Yeah.
And that could be produced in many different ways. So in one way, it could be produced by extreme passionate falling in love. It could be produced by a tragedy, right? It could be produced by simply seeing how small you are in the universe and being amazed at that fact. You know, there's many different avenues to reach that. Sometimes on a quiet, starless night, where the snow falls just silently enough, you know, around you and under a street light, suddenly it hits you that you're here. And I think it's interesting that philosophy is defined as the study of being, because if we think of the encounter remindment of that amazement that there is something rather than nothing as what it means to be human, in the sense that we exist and are aware of being, philosophy is the most human enterprise and lets us become most human, because it returns us to that fact that we are here and that we exist.
Moment of consciousness.
That's right. And what's interesting to me is I think that's not divorced at all from theological or scientific matters. I would say science and theology exist because it's initiated by that amazement of being. You know, I can't tell you how many times I hear scientists, you know, both people I know and celebrity scientists, who always go off on the amazement of the universe. You know, they go like, oh my gosh, look at these atoms composed of it, and go in this sort of like religious rhapsody, right?
Yeah.
And from a strictly scientific perspective, that attitude makes no sense. Because I could just explain you mechanistic causes and then just leave it at that. Like, why are you amazed at that? I just explained it to you. But yet they're still amazed because they're human, and they, like you say, have that spark of consciousness that they are in awe of. And that initiates their interest in the universe. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, people have a hard time with the answer, that's just the way it is. You know? That's just the way it is. There's no you don't have to explain everything, because the scientists will want to go through every single nook and cranny of the universe and categorize and name and write equations for cause and effect relationships for every single thing in the universe, right? Until every last atom has a name or a number, right? And that's kind of something that humans, we're really good at that, but we're also really good at looking at all these names and numbers and looking past those names and numbers and seeing the thing as it is, and being amazed by what it is. Yeah,
and the name and number are derivative of that for seeing. You know, that's something I really deeply believe in. I mean, I think it's something that I think undercuts nominalisms, this idea that you can just put a name on something and comprehend what it is. You know, you first have to understand what it denotes. You know, the only reason that markings that make up numbers in mathematics matter is because in some sense they refer to abstract quantities. And there's also debate about that, and I'm not a philosopher of mathematics, so I can't really say if that's true.
Well, there's a certain level of wonder to the thing before knowing how the thing works.
Exactly. And that's the event of being, right? A being is an event where suddenly something is something. You know, it stands out to me as suddenly, oh my God, there is an entity here. But why? Right? And to seek why through another entity doesn't address the question. Because to do so, you must presuppose another entity. And you can do it ad infinitum. Or you can just pause it, like pound the desk and go, it's God. It's the first cause. It's, Big Bang. It still doesn't answer it. Because you just evoked another entity. But that must presuppose being. But why being? Like, that's a metaphysical question in the genuine sense of the word. And that's not something that scientists and theologians can answer. But it does inspire their motivation, I think, in some cases.
Have you ever heard the phrase that any sufficiently advanced science that is incomprehensible to the ordinary person is indistinguishable from magic?
Actually, I had that thought because before we did this podcast, I saw the wires that you're connecting to the computer. And I'm a big fan of analog technology because in some sense it still grounds me. It still allows me to understand what I'm doing and to have some sort of interaction that's tangible with
By the way, everyone, that all failed.
Yeah, that's why we're recording our phone and doing the computer thing. At least they can see us this way. It's cool. So
go ahead.
No, it's okay. I mean, well, example gratia, or the phone. Like I don't have sufficient knowledge to understand how it connects to the phone tower. Never bothered to look. I'm sure I could figure it out, but I mean, for me, it's magic because I'm a vulgar, pleb who just doesn't understand, how things like that work. It's almost like
How phone goes to the phone tower?
Exactly. Yeah, it's like wizardry, so at least with wires, I can see tangibly where it goes. I can understand electrons, transfer information. But like when it comes to phone tower, I'm like, how the hell does it happen? I have no idea. And I
Well, if I put it right here, it's going through your head.
Right, exactly. It's going to give me brain cancer in like 50 years. And there's all these published studies. I'll be there, a geriatric, watching some sort of advert on my YouTube ad, iPhone, and it'll be like, have you ever had like a smartphone in the early 2000s? Yes, I did. Like, if you have brain cancer, yes, I do. It's like, well, then maybe it's time for compensation, or something like that. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, no, I'm a big fan of analog technology at the very least because you can see how it works. But you're right, like there's a sort of mysticism that comes from ignorance of how something works. But again, I think that mysticism, kind of going back to our original point, is different than the mysticism of being. Because again, if you explain to me how the technology works, then that sort of ignorance dissipates. Like now I have knowledge, right? But
sometimes the wonder increases. You're like, whoa.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, because now I have more entities at my disposal. Now the world's more complicated and interesting than you initially thought. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But again, that's because now I'm aware of more beings. And now being has a bigger significance for me.
You know what's really crazy?
Yeah, what's up?
Record players. Like, you know what I mean? Like this little needle goes onto a disc and it makes sound. What?
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
Like what? Like this makes more sense somehow. Like, you know what I mean? Like the music coming out of the box.
Right.
Like, okay, but how does this needle? But I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't bothered looking up either, so I couldn't tell you. But,
yeah, I looked it up and it didn't make any sense. I was like,
that's so funny.
It still doesn't make sense.
That's so funny.
Well, it's kind of there's this drug that people are using. I don't know if it was aspirin or they're using it for the longest time, right? Mm-hmm. And they didn't know how it worked. Mm-hmm. And like 20 years later or something, they finally figured out, oh, it does this to the body, and that's how it works, right? They were just using it because it like relieved pain or relieved inflammation, right? And we don't always need to understand how something works.
It's to use it, or
a matter of it's utilitarian, right? It's utility, right, in our lives. Like if a phone calls and I can talk to someone, then it works, and I don't really need to understand how it works, right? As long as it works. But there is the notion, well, if we don't understand how it works, then there may be some other harms that we're unaware of, right?
Of course, yeah. I think of correlation versus causation discussions in philosophy of science. So it's basically the notion that just because two events are temporally correlated, of course, doesn't mean that one causes the other.
Yeah.
But I mean, sometimes it's just good enough to do correlations because, when one thing happens, the other thing happens with regular succession, then it maybe has some sort of practical utility.
It's good for predictions.
Yeah. So like a rat, like in the cage, knows that if it pushes a button at a certain time every day, it gets food. And doesn't bother with how that happens. It just knows that there's this correlation that if I push this thing, then I get fed, right? But maybe that leads to sort of the reason why I think some people see science, theology, and philosophy as sort of aristocratic endeavors. Because like Aristotle, for example, would say that, the mind that's finally at leisure is no longer burdened by common, needs, right? And provided that they're not mentally ill, like a billionaire who just needs more money for the sake of money, right? Like they're just content with what they have. They finally open up their lives to finally ask themselves questions like, well, what causes this? And some people just don't give a damn about that. They just, well, I got what I needed, so I don't care. And I would say from a certain perspective that it's necessary, like the practical world precedes the theoretical. Like for example, my ability to pick up and hold this mug presupposes sort of a pre-definitional, almost practical understanding of this entity. Like I know what this entity is, but not in the conscious sense. It's like I have an awareness of it that is non-conscious, right? Through which I understand it and I'm able to utilize it. And we can make it explicit. So, and in fact, this is the ground for abstract conception of a cup, right, or a mug that I'm using. How am I going to define this mug? Well, in order to do so, it has to be standing out in my being or not my being, but in my experience as an entity. And the only reason I can understand it as an entity is because I have some sort of practical engagement with it that is based on implicit assumption of its existence or what it is, like its entitivity. And so in that sense, I think the practical always precedes the theoretical. Like, I think you can't have a discussion of like, I often bring this up as a good example. We in our metaphysics course, we I think it was our either first lecture or second lecture, jokingly had to define what a sandwich was. And it was a good opportunity for us to learn about categorization and necessary and sufficient conditions. So you can find something like that the word sandwich denotes, right, as part of the category. And then you might base a definition of that category off that example. But something might present a counterexample of something that we would also call a sandwich. It doesn't fit that definition. Kind of in Socratic sense, we begin developing categories. But the question that I think, no one bothers with, but I think is absolutely paramount is, where the hell did the sandwich come from in the first place?
Yeah.
To have the example and then the counterexample, you both must have this implicit non-conceptual knowledge of what the sandwich is. Because we're just now developing the concept and creating necessary and sufficient conditions. So you had to have already known what it was in some sense.
Have you ever heard of the concept of mindful eating?
Mindfulness, yes. Mindful eating?
So mindful
in what
eating
sense?
is when you're supposed to eat very slow.
Okay.
Enjoy your food, take many bites, and you're supposed to be grateful for the people who cooked it, or et cetera, et cetera. So this one time, me and my fiance were at a restaurant, and I partially as a joke, partially to be grateful, partially to be mindful eating, et cetera, we started saying, I'm thankful for the trucks who hauled in the wheat for this pizza. And then I was like, I'm thankful for the people who worked at the gasoline place to get the gas in the truck to bring it here, right? Et cetera. So you could keep saying that until you thank God, basically, for the
I think the first
pizza.
Cause for causing the sandwich, yeah.
Yeah. So there's how did the sandwich come to be, right?
Yeah.
And it's infinitely many things coming together to form the sandwich.
Yeah. Many, many, many things. No, I like that. It's really good practice to try to stave off the contempt for being. Like you may be having a bad day, but you have a moment of clarity and goodness, and you just sit there and bless the fact that you exist for a moment to experience this. And I think that's actually really good. I should practice that more often, because I think sometimes I'm that kind of person that would be pacing around the living room with a handful of Cheetos, just eating mindlessly. And
I eat really fast because I'm constantly in a time crunch. I'm constantly because I wake up in the morning. I do my thing. I go to work, and then I think, okay, I get 2 hours to do this after work. I get another 2 hours to do that. I get another 2 hours to do this. And then if one little thing goes wrong, I'm like, I don't have less time for all those things I want to do now. So
wow,
but. There's a thing that I heard is that we all have the time to do the things that we want to do in life. And just because you don't have the time today doesn't mean you won't have the time tomorrow. And you can make time for things, but you need to be willing to sacrifice other stuff, right?
Yeah. There's this great essay called On the Shortness of Life. It's not really an essay, actually. It's a personal letter that Seneca wrote to his friend Paulinus, I think, who is just going to retirement, and encouraging him to embrace his retirement, to do the most meaningful things with his life. And I chose this as my staff pick for February, because February apparently is Library Lovers Month. And so to let the community know what we are or who we are at the library. Yeah, basically I asked the whole staff to select their favorite novel or book, whatever, and then put like a blurb about 100 words or less, about the book or why they like it, and then put it in as a bookmark. And so I chose On the Shortness of Life, and my blurb was something along the lines of, life for human beings isn't usually brief. It's just that we waste most of our time doing worthless things. And so Seneca calls us to acknowledge that and to say, well, all things being equal, like, so say if you don't have exceptional circumstance, like you have cancer, you're going to die in a day or whatever, that maybe you feel like your life is brief just because you've wasted it.
Yeah.
And so maybe you should take control of your life, of the lot of time that you have left, so you can die saying, I spent my life well.
Yeah.
Or in other words,
Puss in Boots 2.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you can say Puss in Boots 2, maybe Puss in Boots 2 or Puss in Boots Last Wish.
Well, I think isn't it Puss in Boots 2, The Last Wish?
I don't know. I wish I had my phone here because I don't want to.
You know what? It doesn't matter.
Well, the point that it's kind of a good example. We both have the perception.
How dare you call it the...
Yeah. Semantics.
Don't you dare correct me again.
Yeah.
All right. Perfect. Well, I think we should end it there because I know you're going to be leaving soon. We can
That's
have
right. Yeah.
We can have a little time to not be on air.
Yeah, a little day and moi for us before we part ways. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the podcast, Dylan, and we'll be right back at you.